Is this working? Good. We'll start again. And as you know from your program, we're lucky to have with us E.J. Dionne to give the keynote talk. E.J. needs little introduction. Most of you have been reading his column in the Washington Post for many years, listened to his thoughtful commentary on PBS, MSNBC, and other networks. But it's useful perhaps to remember that beyond that, E.J. has had an intense preoccupation with the issues of this conference, politics and religion, for many, many years that make him, along with being both a scholar and a journalist, a very fit keynote speaker. After having done a Rhodes Scholarship, he stayed at Oxford to get a DPhil in sociology. And E.J. worked as a correspondent at the New York Times, including in Rome, where he also covered the Vatican, among other things. And in what now seems very prescient, his first book was entitled Why Americans Hate Politics. So earlier than many, he was onto and anticipated the trend in kind of anti-politics, politics, and polarization, which has now come to be the dominant theme in our political life. And after moving to the Washington Post in 1993 and becoming a senior fellow at the Brookings Institute, he has continued through his books to explore these central preoccupations of politics and religion. If I just list some of the titles of his most recent books, you'll get an idea of where his thought has gone. 2004, Stand Up, Fight Back, Republican Toughs, Democratic Wimps, and Politics of Revenge. Sold Out, that's S-O-U-L-E-D, Sold Out, Reclaiming Faith and Politics After the Religious Right, 2008. Our Divided Political Heart, The Battle for the American Idea in an Age of Discontent, 2012. And his most recent book is One Nation After Trump, A Guide for the Perplexed, the Disillusioned, the Desperate, and the Not Yet Deported. That was from last year, co-authored with Norman Ornstein and Thomas Mann. Along with his journalistic and scholarly work, he is also a professor at the McCourt School of Public Policy at Georgetown. So without further ado, I'll give you E.J., and then afterwards, Anthea Butler will join me in having a little bit of back and forth with E.J., and then we'll open up to all of you for more discussion. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I just want to salute Columbia for having this series of meetings on populism. It's the right time to do it, and I particularly salute them for having this session on religion. Now, you might say that religion only starts concerning academics when they start to worry about it, but I don't think that's true of anybody in this room. I've always said that Democrats discovered God in the 2004 exit polls after Bush's reelection, and since you can discover God anywhere, that's okay. I want to thank Sandro for that introduction. I have known Sandro, I believe, longer than any other person in this room. I think I met Sandro when he was 13 years old. His big sister was a very good friend of mine, is a very good friend of mine, although I haven't seen her. I've got to look her up. And so I have taken a brotherly interest that I have no right in taking in his extraordinary success. And I want to remind everybody that very unfortunately for Italy, his excellent book on Silvio Berlusconi is now relevant again. And so he has to get a new edition of that. Just a couple of shout outs. One is I have been blessed with extraordinary journalistic colleagues over the years, and it's really good to see my friend Tom Edsel here. Tom, as many of you know, is a tough realist. He's an empiricist who regularly shoots down ungrounded optimism and pretension. And behind that whole veneer is one of the warmest and most generous people I know. It's really great to see Tom again. Also, my friend Todd Gitlin. Appropriately enough for this conference, I discovered Todd Gitlin's work when I was a teenager in Commonweal magazine. I bet no one here knew that Todd wrote for Commonweal He wrote book reviews for Commonweal, probably making a little extra money, although Commonweal didn't pay anything to speak of. And I've admired him, and he's been a friend for many years. And my one assignment to everybody, if you've not read his book on the 60s, you should read Todd's book on the 1960s, which I think is one of the most honest accounts of that era. And lastly, just to shout out three colleagues, one of whom I think is not here yet, Vanessa Williamson, Jose Casanova, Vanessa from Brookings, Jose Casanova, and Mike Kazin from Georgetown. You will be hearing from Mike in my talk. It is an honor to speak before so many scholars whose work I've admired for a long time. Many of them are in the talk itself. It's also a little daunting. I am reminded of the campaign event where Al Smith was confronted with a heckler who said, "Tell them all you know, Al, it won't take long." And Smith, being a clever guy, shot back, "I'll tell them all we both know, and it won't take longer." And I figure at that point I should just sit down and listen to everyone. But I will soldier on, confident that this group, above all, understands how hard it is to get a handle on the subject before us, and recalling the man who once had a chance to speak to God and asked, "When will the world's religions usher in an era of peace and justice?" And God replied, "Not in my lifetime." Right at the start, we should acknowledge that this conference is exploring two areas on which there is much contention, often of an angry sort. Even in this graceful setting, in the first session, we already heard some of this interchange. One idea I was introduced to in graduate school that has stayed with me and come back again and again is the idea that there are essentially contested concepts. Concepts whose very definitions are under constant challenge and debate. And as we saw on the first panel in the very sharp exchange, and I'm going to be very Clintonian, I side a little bit with both sides of that discussion in my talk, but I come down more or less in that discussion. Populism is one of those essentially contested concepts. It is not simply that there is much dispute about whether populism is a good thing or a bad thing, although there's a lot of that. It is also that scholars and political activists and journalists and politicians cannot agree on exactly what populism is. People's value judgments often depend on their definition. Mike Kazin underscored how broadly the term can be applied in his 1995 book, The Populist Persuasion, when he cited a comedian who said in 1992, "To be populist, all you have to be is popular." Would that it were that simple. Here's another indicator of how vexed this word is. The British scholar Margaret Canovan, whose path-breaking work on populism was published 37 years ago, noted that unlike conservatives or socialists, populists themselves typically, at least in the past, rejected the term populist when it was applied to them, although that has changed some in recent years. The fact that, as she observed, there have been both democracies and dictatorships that can reasonably be described as populist shows the very difficult ground we're trying to take a stand on. Now, I'll return to the definitional difficulties of populism in a moment, and I promise not to bog us down in them too much. My friend and academic advisor, Stephen Lukes, whose work many of you know, was introducing a series of objections to an argument that he was making once, and he finally called a halt to the whole process when he recalled a friend who said, "Why make things difficult when, with just a little more effort, we can make them impossible?" I think that happens to us a lot in these kinds of discussions, and there's little point in that. And religion presents similar difficulties. It is, depending on your point of view, a hellish thicket of intellectual problems or a heavenly opportunity for exploring human motivations. We human beings have been worrying about religion literally for millennia. Religion can be royalist or populist. It can be democratic or authoritarian. It can be as this worldly political or as otherworldly apolitical as you want it to be. My own Catholic Church celebrates a Sunday in honor of Christ the King and a feast day in honor of St. Joseph the Worker. The political implications of these two celebrations are as different as their historical origins. A monarch against a worker, a monarch against a potentially populist or perhaps social democratic worker. Or consider the great prayer to the Blessed Virgin, the Magnificat. Is it surprising that those who were devoted to liberation theology have drawn inspiration from this prayer? A key moment in it is the following: he hath put down the mighty from their thrones and hath exalted the humble and meek. He has filled the hungry with good things, and the rich he hath sent away empty. Who knew that the Blessed Mother endorsed Bernie Sanders? My old teacher, Harvey Cox, the great liberal theologian, whom I will get back to. By the way, someone in the audience raised eschatology. One of the best courses I will ever take in my life was Harvey Cox's course, which was called Eschatology and Politics. I love having eschatology and politics on my my list of courses. And I would note, by the way, that the questioner raised the eschatological underpinnings of the Trump campaign. In Harvey's course, the eschatology was much more linked to Marx's end of history. So it shows how many ways you can take eschatology. But Harvey wrote a lot about the radical nature of Marian devotion, and Pope Francis has validated that insight again and again. Now, the idea of the Blessed Mother being radical is not a view much accepted either in the academy or among devoutly conservative believers. In fact, there is a deep ongoing tension among religious people. Irving Kristol years ago made an observation that I think can be helpful to us in our deliberations. I assume the tension between the prophetic and the rabbinic, or the orthodox and the Gnostic, I assume that, he said, to be eternal. Religion can be a radical inspiration to the masses, or it can be their opiate. It can be used to prop up the powers that be, or it can be their undoing. In our history, both supporters and opponents of slavery invoked Scripture to support their view. Those who turn to the book of Leviticus are looking primarily for rules and commands. Those who turn to John 3:16 are seeking personal salvation. But those who look to Exodus are seeking a story of liberation, and it is a story that has been mobilized on behalf of popular movements throughout history, including our own struggles against slavery and for civil rights. Exodus to this day is central to the preaching in African American churches. In his magnificent book, Exodus and Revolution, Michael Walzer offers 3 rules for Exodus politics. And listen carefully to the first one. First, that wherever you live, it is probably Egypt. Second, that there is a better place, a world more attractive, a promised land. And third, that the way to the land is through the wilderness. There is no way to get from here to there except by joining together and marching. This is movement politics, and I think this view can easily be assimilated into populist politics. Now, because my purpose here is to open rather than to close a discussion, I will offer more a framework for our conversation than definitive judgments. Precisely because there are a number of populisms and many varieties of political action rooted in religious faith and religious identity, the relationship between religion and populism will always be complicated. One might begin with a simple rule of thumb. When religion is viewed principally as a call to justice and reform, let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream, Martin Luther King declared, quoting Amos, it is an ally of progressive movements and democratic forms of populism. When religion is seen primarily as a form of personal identity that reinforces an us holding off a threatening them, it is usually a prop for reactionary forms of populism, those offering narrow definitions of what constitutes the people. This is religion invoked against the infidel or against secular elites or against new immigrants, and in support of a tribe that sees itself as beleaguered and threatened. It is the Christianity of the Reverend Robert Jeffress, the pastor of the First Baptist Church in Dallas, who explained his support for Donald Trump in 2016 this way. Frankly, I want the meanest, toughest son of a gun I can find, and I think that's the feeling of a lot of evangelicals. They don't want a Casper milquetoast as the leader of the free world. He has said that he believes that Christians in Christianity have been marginalized. He always gets a laugh when he says, we're going to start saying Merry Christmas in America again. We all know what he's talking about. Thus the Reverend Jeffress. Now notice here that I have already made a distinction between two forms of populism, and there are certainly more than two. Politicians of diverse ideological persuasions and levels of attachment to liberal democracy have long denounced established economic, cultural, and political elites, while portraying themselves as the champions of the people. Scholars have struggled to define when this behavior constitutes populism and when it doesn't. They have also sought to apply the term beyond its American origins in the broadly left-of-center agrarian People's Party in the late 20th century to explain the modern phenomenon whereby populist leaders with widely varying political ideologies have come to power or threatened establishments around the world. And I also think that there is a great distinction between the way Americans have used the term populism and the way it's been used in Europe, and a distinction also in the way it's been used in Latin America, as has come up in the earlier part of this discussion. Now, by the way, our American populists invoke their faith regularly, and none more so than our most prominent populist, who is also a well-known fundamentalist Christian. William Jennings Bryan, who's already been referenced, used rhetoric that is incomprehensible without an understanding of his devotion to Christianity. Recall his most famous line in his most famous speech. Having behind us the commercial interests and the labor interests and all the toiling masses, he said at the 1896 Democratic National Convention, we shall answer their demands for a gold standard by saying to them, you shall not press down upon the brow of labor this crown of thorns. You shall not crucify mankind on a cross of gold. This was old-time populism, and it was also old-time religion. The story of Jesus, who threw the money changers out of the temple, a recurring theme in populist rhetoric, is invoked in the name of the toiling masses. And this was typical of American populist rhetoric. Rhys Williams, whom we heard from on the last panel, and Susan Alexander have written that again and again populist writers call down the judgment of God and the Almighty's designs for the American nation against worldly transgressors who made their fortunes unjustly and used their power to keep the plain people enslaved. Like many prophetic voices in American culture, populism drew its images from the Hebrew prophets and Jesus' actions in the gospel. Populism's prophetic civil religion is not a revolutionary call for the destruction of the system in either the political or economic realms. It had a priestly subtext in that it connected American to God's plans. Populism argued for a return to first principles, a rededication to the nation's founding commitments. Aligning the country with those principles would be a return to the natural order and to the society God intended for America. I think that is a fascinating observation, and it suggests that even within populist progressivism, there is, in some sense, a deep conservatism and traditionalism, because it is often a call forward by going back to core principles. Mike Kazin, who is also, by the way, the great biographer of William Jennings Bryan, got at the capacious complexity of the term when he urged advocates of change to stress the harmonious, hopeful, and pragmatic aspects of populist language and to disparage the meaner ones. Of course, that positive statement says that there is a negative side to it too. You can take populism in many directions. Now, because the meaner forms of populism have come to the fore in movements such as France's National Front, populism is, as I said, more a term of opprobrium in Europe. Yet for decades, there has been a rich American debate about populism as well. Richard Hofstadter and other historians and social scientists in the 1950s and others inspired by Hofstadter's approach stressed the anti-immigrant feelings of the early populists and anti-Semitism within the movement, and often cast it as a revolt against modernity. Hofstadter's view was very much affected, I think, by his experience during the McCarthy era. But a later generation of historians, notably Lawrence Goodwin and more recently Charles Postel, have emphasized the deeply democratic character of American populism, pointing to examples of its efforts to build coalitions across racial lines in the earliest years of populism, and of the intellectual depth and curiosity of many of populism's grassroots supporters. Postel insists that the populists were in no way anti-intellectual. In his 2007 book, The Populist Vision, he notes that the original populists were not Don Quixotes tilting at the windmills of modernity and commercial change. Rather, they were seeking fair access to the benefits of modernity. He also points out that our populists were known as a reading and writing party. So eager were they to spread the word across the farms and small towns of America. John Judas, in his book, The Populist Explosion, argues that populism should actually not really be thought of as an ideology, but as a political logic, as an attack on elites in the name of the masses, rather than a coherent social program or a belief system. I think he draws a very helpful distinction between right-wing and left-wing populists. Right-wing populists such as Trump define the people's enemies as foreigners, racial minorities, and other outsiders who are said to be beneficiaries of coddling by an out-of-touch establishment. I think that word coddling came up in the last panel. Left-wing populists like Bernie Sanders, although I agree with you, we could argue about whether Bernie's a populist or not. John Judas argues that he is, champion the interests of ordinary people against an economic and political elite, but without scapegoating marginalized communities. The Australian political scientist Benjamin Moffat, like Judas, argues that populism should be understood as a political style because it encompasses a range of performative behaviors that can overlay a wide variety of policies and ideologies. In his view, populism has three distinct features: appeals to the people versus the elite, the performance of bad manners, or as Trump liked to say, political incorrectness, and the perception of crisis or breakdown or threat in society. Now, Judas and Moffat do not necessarily see populists as good or bad for democracy, although Judas argues that populism can be a useful warning sign that the prevailing political ideology isn't working and needs repair. But Jan Werner Muller, whose name has already come up and I suspect will come up throughout this conference, is primarily interested in the European and Latin American examples of populism, and he's argued that the label should be reserved for a much less benign force in our modern democracies. It is not sufficient for a political actor to be critical of elites to count as a populist, Muller argues. All politicians want to appeal to the people and speak to how sensitive they are to the thoughts and feelings of common men and women. And many have authentic ambitions to speak up on behalf of those who have been ill-represented and left behind. But he writes that only populists claim that they and they alone represent the people. Or as Trump put it, I alone can fix it. Muller sees populism as an exclusionary form of identity politics and as a danger to democracy. He concludes his book, What is Populism, this way. He says, for democracy requires pluralism and the recognition that we need to find fair terms of living together as free and equal but also irreducibly diverse citizens. The idea of the single, homogeneous, authentic people is a fantasy. And it's a dangerous fantasy because populists do not thrive on conflict and encourage not only thrive on conflict and encourage polarization, they also treat their political opponents as enemies of the people and seek to exclude them altogether. Now, on the whole, I have to say that I take Mueller's warnings, and yes, Gene's warnings, seriously about the dangers of populism as a form of exclusionary politics. It can indeed be that. But in the end, I am closer to Judas and to Moffat, and also to Rees and to Rogers, as well as to historians like Goodwin and Postel, in seeing the democratic potential of populism and the importance of drawing distinctions among its various manifestations. I share Mike Kazin's view that it is only when leftists and liberals themselves talked in populist ways, hopeful, expansive, even romantic, that they were able to lend their politics a majoritarian cast and help markedly improve the common welfare. And I am sympathetic to Rick Perlstein's instinct that as long as there are elites making policy decisions in unaccountable ways that favor the few over the many, there should be populist movements and will be populist movements, and what's more, we should encourage populist movements. But again, we should do this while being mindful of Mueller's insights that authoritarian forms of populism exist, and that the tip-off to their character is their effort to offer an exceptionally narrow definition of the people, restricted by race or culture or gender or religion or in many other ways. We need to acknowledge populism's democratic impulses while resisting the forms that my colleague William Galston in his forthcoming book describes as anti-pluralist. A populism whose aim is to include the excluded can be compatible with pluralism. A populism that proposes new forms of exclusion cannot be. I think we need the same sense of discernment when it comes to what Harvey Cox described as people's religion. I draw this term from his 1973 book, The Seduction of the Spirit, the use and misuse of people's religion. The title all by itself tells you a lot about what that book explores. Cox defines people's religion as the collective story of the whole people and includes both the folk religion of ordinary people in its unsophisticated form and the popular religion that occurs outside the formal ecclesiastical institutions and the ad hoc rituals and do-it-yourself liturgies. Now, like all who stress liberation, Cox evokes the Exodus story, and he links it to the Easter story. Exodus points to the emancipation of man from political and economic bondage, he wrote. Easter, the resurrection of Christ, is the Christian parallel of the Exodus. Easter faith celebrates the liberation of all men and women from sin and death. Sin, he goes on, is understood as whatever chains the people to the past, and death as whatever terrifies them about the future. God is that power which, despite all setbacks, never admits to final defeat. Now, this is obviously a political theology for the left, and Cox was a close student and friend of the liberation theologians of Latin America. Thus did Gustavo Gutierrez and Leonardo Boff and other liberation theologians stress the link between liberation from sin and liberation from oppression. The denunciation of injustice implies the rejection of the use of Christianity to legitimize the established order, Gutierrez wrote. And also this from Gutierrez, the God of Exodus is the God of history and of political liberation more than he is the God of nature. Now, I raise Cox and the liberation theologians first because their witness can, and I think should be seen as a form of populism, a form, as several people on the first panel suggested, that we ignore at a moment when the stress is on right-wing manifestations of religious populism. Many of our 19th and early 20th century populists would relate to much of this language, even if their theology might have been considerably more orthodox and traditional than the theology of Cox or Gutierrez. If we need to think about more than one kind of populism, we also need to think of more than one kind of political theology, and thus more than one kind of religious populism. Now, Cox stresses something else, and this goes to the title of his book, that religion, including people's religion, can be manipulated. The seduction of the spirit, he writes, is the calculated twisting of people's natural and healthy religious instincts for purposes of control and domination. It is the cruelest abuse of religion because it slyly enlists people in their own manipulation. Now, those of us on the progressive side of politics might well see Trump's success with evangelical conservatives as a classic instance of the seduction of the spirit. But the railing of conservative evangelicals to Trump, as the Reverend Jeffress's comments suggest, can also be analyzed as a form of reaction against the loss of cultural dominance, as part of a long trend of white Southern conservatives away from the Democratic Party because of reaction around race and civil rights, and also because of the increasing dominance of abortion and gay marriage as the issues of primary concerns to religious Christians, both Catholic and Protestant. Now, to note the link between the religious right and racial reaction is not a slander, nor does it deny the existence of authentic religious feeling among Trump voters or religious conservatives generally. It is simply a matter of history and a reflection on the nature of the Trump campaign, which trafficked more explicitly with racial politics than either the McCain campaign in 2008 or the Romney campaign of 2012. And it is worth noting that the galvanizing event in the history of the religious right was the Internal Revenue Service's decision to revoke the tax-exempt status of Bob Jones University and other religious schools that discriminated against non-whites. The religious liberty slogan was, at that time, implicitly linked to segregation. And the historian Randall Balmer suggested that in 2016, the religious conservative movement may have gone full circle back to a kind of politics we saw in the late 1970s and early 1980s. But it must also be understood as well that while Trump's white evangelical margin over Clinton was very high, his share of their votes was only slightly higher than the normal Republican margin. The conversion to the right and the Republican Party was a process that began long ago among white evangelical Christians and Christian conservatives more generally. And this is because the ideas and strategies of populism have been mobilized by American conservatives for more than 4 decades, as Kazin and others have noted, and also a moment when many on the left were pulling away from populism. I think a singular contribution of the to this effort was the neoconservative effort to weaponize the writing of the dissident Yugoslavian Marxist Milovan Djilas, who wrote of the rise of a new class. He did that in the context of Yugoslavian politics, but the new class idea was used by Irving Kristol and others, beginning in the late 1970s, to identify a liberal elite, urban and urbane, college-educated, socially liberal, often hostile to religion and traditional values. An unapologetic sympathizer with capitalism, although Kristol gave it only 2 and not 3 chairs in the titles of one of his books, and of corporate America, Kristol saw an opportunity to identify an alternative elite to the economic elite. An American populism that had been directed against banks and the wealthy and concentrated economic power could now be turned against concentrated cultural power, the cultural power of this new class. And it was this sort of populism that was practiced most beginning in the Nixon era and reaching its apogee in the Reagan era. Reagan appealed openly for working class votes, and his famous invocation of family, work, neighborhood spoke to those whom the Republican speechwriter William Gavin called street corner conservatives. That sounds pretty populist too. Hollywood, television producers, long-haired college students back then, government bureaucrats, public interest lawyers, college professors, and journalists could all be lumped together, not simply as groups, but as a class, and a class deserving a comeuppance. And this created a new form of cultural populism. Now, Trump-era populism is built on this work, but it has a distinctive quality. It imports from Europe certain forms of far-right populism that are quite different from the ones that we have been accustomed to. Yes, it's true, it represents in many ways an old American nativism, and there certainly were nativist strains among some of the 19th century populists. But Trumpian populism is harder edged, Some of its extreme advocates actually use the words blood and soil, a sinister phrase given its association with the crimes of the 1930s. And it has gained a following precisely because American demography and America's cultural turn have given conservative white Christians grounds to worry that, as many of them have told journalists in interview after interview, my children will not inherit the country I grew up in. My friend and colleague Robert Jones published a book last year called The End of White Christian America, which did not render a value judgment, but simply looked at the facts. Two trends: long-term immigration from countries outside of Europe and the abandonment of religious affiliation by upwards of 40% of the millennial generation. These trends together have turned white Christians into an actual minority of the American population for the first time in our history. Many white evangelical Christians have an intimation of this, and it's one reason they are happy to hear a presidential candidate defend their right to say Merry Christmas. Yes, the Reverend Jeffress was right. We all know what he's talking about. And I think this is a big part of what he's talking about. Now, if I may speak for just a moment as a Christian who believes in liberal democracy and whose views can be fairly characterized as social democratic, I believe that it is essential that Christians battle against all forms of populist nationalism that are dangerous to human freedom, to religious and ethnic minorities, and to the common good. As Samuel Moyn has written, serious Christians had to disentangle themselves from the nationalistic populism of the 1930s, sometimes too late. To do so, they emphasize human dignity as the touchstone for the more humane future they hope to build. It was vague and ill-defined, but it captured something sacred about the human person that ought not to be violated. Those of us who are Catholics of my persuasion are heartened that Pope Francis has provided a strong, clear voice for the defense of the dignity of every human being, and especially of the poorest and the marginalized. And if I may speak as a journalist, although now the sort who is perfectly free to express strong opinions, I think this upsurge of populism should push us to report on and understand the sources of discontent and the hurt that are producing this populist surge. It is important to disentangle genuine prejudice and bigotry, which should be identified and called out fearlessly, from the frustrations that are sometimes channeled into bigotry, but have roots in injustices and what Richard Sennett and Jonathan Cobb memorably called many years ago the hidden injuries of class. We should not write fearfully or condescendingly about the many forms of populism that are rooted in a democratic civic nationalism, which the historian Gary Gerstle defined as a belief in the fundamental equality of all human beings, in every individual's inalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and in a democratic government that derives its legitimacy from the people's consent. This is a kind of populism that speaks for what's best in the American idea. In examining populist forms of religion, people's religion in Cox's phase, we should be eager to hear people's stories, to learn how and why the sacred is mobilized into politics. Again, we need to disentangle. In the case of faith, between the use of religion purely as a social marker to divide and exclude and aggrandize a particular group, and the invocation of religiously rooted principles on behalf of human dignity and humankind's constant search for meaning, belonging, and fellowship. As I said at the beginning, when Martin Luther King invoked the prophet Amos about justice rolling down like waters, he was also reminding his secular friends and allies that our religious traditions often nurture the seeds of liberation. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the great German theologian who was killed because of his participation in a plot to kill Adolf Hitler, offered us guidance on how to live, but I think in the process he provided an enlightening optic on the moral obligations of journalists and scholars who are grappling with these questions. We must learn to regard people less in light of what they do or omit to do, Bonhoeffer said, and more in light of what they suffer. If we are looking for a starting point in our efforts to understand the difficult times in which we find ourselves, we could do far worse than this. Thank you very much.
Anthea, do you want to start?
First, I want to thank EJ. This was really great, and you gave me some things to think about. You gave me some things to think about. I want to start off at the end, because one of the things that I've been thinking about through all this talk about populism, you talked about disengaging the prejudice and bigotry from the real hurts and human concerns. But what happens when the prejudice and bigotry create the hurts and concerns? This is something that I just have been really troubled by throughout this time about talk about populism, because what I'm seeing is that, people of color have hurts and concerns that come out of the racism. And I'm trying to figure out how we talk about this in a different way, because it seems to me that this is the out for people who are racist. It's the out that allows them to say, my economic concerns or whatever, when we've had 50 years of republicanism doing this thing, right? About saying those people are taking your jobs. These people are taking everything from you. And then you should be hurt. And if they really do have those economic concerns, they would turn that back on the leaders that they consider to be populist leaders like Trump, right? Because Trump is the one that's bringing people in from other countries to work at Mar-a-Lago. Right? So this is where I have a problem when I hear this all the time. And I want us to talk about this today, because I don't quite know the answer. I'm coming at this from a religious studies perspective. But I really seem to think that when we do this, it discounts the people who actually have this pain because of the racism, because of the prejudice, because of all those things, who have been denigrated and can't get anything because those other people think that they're taking something.
Well, thank you for that. I feel really very strongly that Trumpism is based on the idea of holding one group's pain against another group's pain. Yeah. And that the alternative politics we need is a politics that takes the pain of the suffering seriously across the board and makes distinctions about the nature of the suffering at various points. I heard a very powerful talk a couple of days ago. It was an event about the 50th anniversary of the Kerner Commission, which suggested we do a whole lot of things in the country about racism and injustice that we didn't do for the most part. We did a few of them, but not a lot. And the Reverend Barber said something very interesting. He quoted a speech by Martin Luther King, in which King went back himself to the early populist movement. The Holy Spirit was shining upon me because it helped me for today's session. And what King pointed out very specifically, that in the earliest days of the populist movement, it was a multiracial movement. It was an alliance between poor whites and African Americans, recently freed slaves, against an establishment that did not want to invest in public schools, that favored plantation class over small farmers and so on. And then as time went on, the ruling class, in King's account, decided that the only way to stop this was to begin to play racial politics and to split the African Americans from poor whites. And it destroyed it really set back and ultimately destroyed the populist movement. I don't see any way from here to there, if I can use Walzer's Exodus reference in this context, without forms of multiracial politics. Now, there are two ways to look at that. One way to look at that is to say, well, we got to get rid of all identity politics because that didn't work. And Mark Lilla is somebody I very much admire. He's written some great things about religion and about social theory, but I disagree with him on this. And the reason I disagree with him on this is because what does end identity politics sound like to African Americans or Latinos? It sounds like we're going to walk away from you because we're going to pursue this other constituency. On the other hand, so I think that progressives have to maintain their commitment to equal rights for immigrants, for Latinos, and for African Americans. But I grew up in a place called Fall River, Massachusetts. Some of you may have seen it recently. It was the mill town where Joe Kennedy gave his speech. These are white working class people who have been hammered. They didn't vote for Trump. They voted for Clinton, but he gained ground there because they were angry. And I think what we need is a politics that takes very seriously that African Americans in particular, but people of color generally, have faced problems that white people have not faced, period, across the board. That's a fact. But it's also a fact that many poor white Americans face particular challenges now, and that if we don't address both of those simultaneously, then we're going to lose. And so this is really a matter of, and it doesn't mean giving in to racism in any way. It doesn't mean not calling out racism in any way. One of the biggest differences, I'll close with this, between Barack Obama winning and Hillary Clinton losing is that Barack Obama in the Midwestern states got around 45% of the votes of non-college educated whites. Hillary Clinton got around 35%, 34%. In Wisconsin, as the number sticks with me, it went from 45 to 34. What we're talking about is that margin, and we've got to pay attention to that margin and say that some of these voters will never vote. About half of what we call the white working class, not exactly accurately because we're using education as the gauge, are probably always going to be conservative. But there is a group of white voters who, for a variety of reasons, shifted to Trump, whom I think can shift to a more progressive kind of politics again. And we have to do that without abandoning core commitments.
I'll leave it at that.
Well, I wouldn't mind a challenge back if you'd like.
I think, I'm thinking about this. Let's just start here, because I want to start with the Democratic Party, because I think this is the party that doesn't know what to do with populism, and the Republicans know how to, weaponize it, right? So one of the things that I think about what you just said is, can we account for that difference in the vote? Because there's also a sort of a sense in which I'm going to vote for a man over a woman, first of all. And Trump put himself in a very particular kind of populism that was very masculine. I can take care of this. We can do this. I'm going to fix it. He can't, she can't fix it for you. I am the one who fixes it. So that's the first thing. And so I want to, inject a conversation about gender into populism too, because I think it's really important. If we keep talking about this and we don't look at gender and the causes of what happens, and then we have a problem. I think the second point is, to your point about dealing with both sides, I think that this is true. But what we have to sort of acknowledge when we do this, and this is my problem, I know there's newspaper people here, so I'll just say it. My problem with all the things that come up about the white working class and everything else is that there's a real sense that the other part of it is just ignored because that's the regular story, right? It's the story that we know. And because the Democrats have tried to chase the white working class, and they haven't been really great at it, or that working class has gone back to Trump in certain kinds of ways, then we get this skewed story. The other thing I think that really needs to be brought up in the midst of this, and I don't know how we unpack it, I don't think we can unpack it even in the next 2 days, but I'd like to try, is to think about nationalism has come up with this. And we've talked about nationalism in lots of different ways. But there is a Christian American nationalism. It used to be a great word called Americanism. And I've been thinking a lot about this since Billy Graham passed, right? And there's an articulation of what Christianity is. And so to get in the weeds of a theological discussion, you and I could do, which is great. I love what you did with the Magnificat. But the fact of the matter is that this reads like a white Protestant narrative about what is happening, and a declension narrative that Trump has been able to take advantage of, which is why evangelicals love him, because on the one hand, they have a tension about, we kind of know that the world's coming to an end and he might be the guy to do it, vis-a-vis, we want to rule in this world, and he's the best way we can do it. Because he's got everything in line to do what we need him to do. He has the power, and we don't care that he had 3 wives and everything else. And there's a certain kind of populism that says we can overlook this in someone else because we need that leader, and he he exemplifies this American Christian nationalism that we have to sort of deal with, because it's the elephant in the room, but I don't know how we unpack that if we keep sort of stepping around and saying populism is about people and everything, when there is a core idea about what people think America is that is so intrinsically tied to this Protestant Christian nationalism of what this place is, that it's hard to get out of it. It's different, I will out myself and say I'm Catholic here. It's the difference between how you think about the universal church and how you think about, for in everybody's mind, the Reformation just might as well be Luther, and then it's 1776, right? There's no middle ground. There's no nothing. And so it's like this America as a Christian nation narrative subsumes every kind of populism, so that when Bryant can say a cross of gold, that's the cross of gold that's supposed to be over America. It's not just a simple cross of gold. It's a cross of gold that America carries into everything.
Just when you were saying that, when John Kennedy was struggling with anti-Catholicism, Schlesinger and Sorensen wrote him a speech for some Catholic event, and it was so Catholic that Kennedy threw it in their faces and said, sometimes I think I'm the only Protestant in this room, which just goes to the complexity, and that Kennedy struggles with this at that moment, are fascinating. Can I just say a couple of quick things on that? Gender, there was no question that there was a gender vote against Hillary Clinton, that she lost votes because she's a woman. And I think there hasn't been enough work on that. I know that that Anna Greenberg did some experiments, the Democratic pollster, that showed a real effect. She sort of asked those kinds of questions pollsters asked that don't require people to say they're sexist, but suggest they are sensitive to gender. And there was clearly a fall-off. So I think that is a piece of it. The problem with the Clinton fall-off is that it is, to use one of my favorite Marxist words, overdetermined. That is to say, there were a whole bunch of things going on at the same time. And if someone was sexist, they could also say, I'm sick of the Clintons. Or they could say any number, or I don't like dynasties.
But her emails.
Yeah, or about her emails, and Benghazi. And that, so there were a lot of things going on there, and then some of the Bernieites who were frustrated with her as well. So, but there's no question there was something with gender going on there. Second, on the working class, again, I think this is very difficult because the whole term working class is vexed if you only talk about the white working class. Tom Edsel can help me on the numbers, but I think a majority of what we would define as a working class consists of non-whites. If not a majority, it's a heck of it's an awfully big number. And that this I take both as a hopeful sign and as a kind of criticism of people making my argument. If you look at the reaction to deindustrialization in places like Reading or Erie, Pennsylvania, or parts of Michigan, or parts of Wisconsin, or parts of Ohio, though mostly white workers in 2016 were reacting to was a process that William J. Wilson, in his great book, When Work Disappears, had identified as happening in inner cities. That book was published in the 1980s. That is, on the one hand, something we should recognize, that deindustrialization has been having this impact for a long time, and we haven't dealt with it adequately. On the other hand, I also take that as potentially a hopeful sign for coalitional politics, because the very forces that created some real chaos within the African American community are the forces that are creating chaos now in many of these more predominantly white communities. And on Christian identity, the only thing I want to say about that is that on a lot of these questions, including the strength of Trump among white evangelical conservatives, we really have to look hard at age. Especially with the rise of religious disaffiliation among Americans pretty much by now under the age of 40, that group of white evangelical Christians is getting older and older. And while evangelicals were growing for a long time, their growth has stopped. It used to be said, well, the liberal churches are losing everybody, but those conservative churches are growing. Now their growth has stopped. And so some of Trump's strength in all of these groups is predicated on age, which suggests that in the long run, change is coming, but demographic change takes a long time to be felt in politics.
Exactly. Thank you.
One thing, you've also written about the transformation, metamorphosis of the Republican Party and the problem of polarization and how one has this discussion in a highly polarized political environment. And brings to mind a conversation I had actually with a colleague of mine, Nick Lemon, who's not here today. And I was saying that in the era when I was sort of coming of age as a, let's say, senior in college when Gerald Ford was president, said, you know, I could meet Republicans who were very reasonable people. We could have disagreements, but they had rational arguments on their side. I could disagree with them, but we could have a very civil discussion. And now when you sort of enter into a world where the beginning of the discussion is that Barack Obama wasn't born in this country, is a secret Muslim, is trying to destroy the country, et cetera, one feels like we've entered into completely different worlds. And Nick said to me, it was very interesting, he said, as somebody who grew up in the South, in New Orleans, I'm much less surprised by this than you. He said, because in my day, I heard all these kinds of conversations, but they were spoken by Democrats. Because you had this period, and I began to think about it, both political parties had a kind of, I don't want to use it, but in a way, a kind of lunatic fringe, if you want to put it, in them. The Democratic Party had a racist base in the South. That was part of its electoral, the Roosevelt coalition that he worked to keep together. And the Republican Party had a Birchite, McCarthyite part, and they canceled each other out because, and met in the center because the leaders of the party could do that. Now we have, with the civil rights legislation of the 60s and the Democrats becoming the party of civil rights and the decision to pursue the Southern strategy on the part of Republicans, you then have this heavy concentration of these two groups that used to be in separate parties becoming a majority in the Republican Party, so that, as we've seen, in primary elections, it's very difficult for a moderate Republican to make it to the general election and so forth. How one has this conversation on a national level in an environment that has become so deeply polarized.
Right. Wait, first of all, it's very important to remember that if you go back 50 years, the Southern Democratic Party was the party of race baiting and segregation. It's why Strom Thurmond left the Truman Party in 1948. But I think there are at least two stages of this polarization. Stage one was kind of rational, and stage two is something different. You did have a party system that was based partly on Civil War alignments and partly on the New Deal alignment. And so you had two parties that at some level were fundamentally irrational in sort of normal political science terms. Jacob Javits represented a district, I think it was just north of here on the west side of Manhattan. Jacob Javits was as liberal as any Democrat you would find. And there were others like that, people like Charles Mathias in Maryland, Ed Brooke in Massachusetts. Nelson Rockefeller was complicated, but sure spent a lot of money. And it's one of my favorite political slogans, by the way. Rocky ran for re-election. He's done a lot, he'll do more. That was it, just straight up basic, and he spent a lot more money. And so what happened is civil rights rationalized. Johnson fighting for civil rights, Goldwater opposing the Civil Rights Bill, kind of rationalized that split. And over time, the very liberal Republicans all left. And, actually John Lindsay in New York being an early one who quit the party. And that was a kind of sort of rational split, but you still had some moderate Southerners who, in the Democratic Party, who were not segregationists, and you had some moderate Northern Republicans. But now I think you're seeing something quite different, and this is why Tom Mann, Norm Ornstein, and I, who just wrote this book together, really insist that what has happened since that first realignment is asymmetric polarization. That if you look at the makeup of the Democratic Party, it still includes a whole lot of people who call themselves moderate, and even some people who call themselves conservative. Some share African Americans, by the way, call themselves conservative because of their religious values. Whereas the Republican Party is becoming more and more uniformly conservative, and their voting patterns in Congress are the same, that Republicans have moved much farther to the right of wherever you would locate the middle if you polled everybody and just figured out where the middle is. They're much farther to the right of that middle than Democrats are to the left. And now Trump has taken that project and injected steroids into it, because the nature of, there's some significant evidence that there's been some flow away from the Republican Party since Trump's election, probably some replacement, but not much. So the people left in the party are even more Trumpist than the party was when he first got the nomination. And I think this asymmetrical polarization makes it really hard to have conversations. There aren't many Republicans, there aren't as many Republicans as there used to be willing to support, say, background checks and an assault weapons ban. And so I think something different has happened, and my own view is that until this brand of republicanism is defeated, it'll be hard to get back to a more reasonable conversation between a humane left and a humane right.
Well, also that asymmetrical part of it that you point out in the Democratic camp makes it very difficult for them, let's say, to have a populist vision that is supported by everyone, because even, for example, one sees on gun control, the moment the Bernie Sanders wing is becoming dominant, then you have a lot of these sort of moderate, vulnerable Democrats in places like Montana or Indiana or Minnesota, who then are on the defensive and in a bit of trouble. And that, but also I'm sort of curious, since you made, in a sense, a defense of a kind of inclusive populism, if you had in your own mind a narrative of what that would sound like in today's context, of what, Obama, as was pointed out, did a nice job of it on the campaign trail, but then not so much in government.
So here I want everybody in the room to help me and decide how we can come together and write a platform that will be victorious and find a message that will be victorious. That's a tall order. I'll tell you what some thoughts I have had on this are. Just to go back to the theme of the conference for a moment, there's a lot of knocking of Hillary Clinton going around. I always get defensive of her when I hear too much knocking of Clinton because A, she won the popular vote, which I think is worth noting. And while I think there were real mistakes made in that campaign, the actual proposals she made would have actually moved us forward on a lot of fronts. And so I have this instinct to want to defend her. And yet I do think there were serious mistakes in not noticing the potential weaknesses in Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin that you saw from Bernie's challenge to her. It should have been very obvious, no matter what their model showed, that they had a problem there and they should have spent a lot more time there. But one of the things that I think was missing, and this is a real problem in our politics, you have right now, let me do the mega problem and then the specific Democratic problem. The mega problem is that right now only one of our parties is racially and religiously diverse. That if you look at the makeup of the core Republican vote, it is overwhelmingly white, it is overwhelmingly Christian, it's also older than the Democratic vote. That means that one of our parties, and I'm not making a moral judgment here, I'm just talking raw, what is their interest? They have more of an interest in racial polarization of some kind in order to win elections, that a more unifying approach, given the current nature of the coalition, might not actually work for them. It didn't work for Romney and it didn't work for McCain. And that when Trump polarized things, he managed to win some of the states that they lost. The Democratic Party has the virtue of being this very diverse coalition, including on religion, that most non-religious Americans are Democrats. Most of that group who say, when you ask, you belong to a church or a synagogue or a mosque, or what's your background, say nothing. Doesn't mean they don't have some religious instincts. There's a whole argument about that, but they're not churched. And that split, and so I think this is a big problem for our politics when only one of our parties has an interest in an inclusive politics. George W. Bush and Karl Rove, I disagree with them on a lot of things, but at least they tried to make a play for Latinos. And they said, in the long run, the Republican Party can't survive if we don't have a Latino vote. And they got about 40% of the Latino vote. That actually created a very different kind of politics in terms of racial and ethnic and immigration division. But this religious split in the Democratic Party can render politicians tongue-tied about religion, and that's what happened to Hillary Clinton. That I think one of the most authentic Hillary Clintons was the Hillary Clinton who spoke about the role of her Methodist background in creating her own politics. That was the real deal. Everybody who knows her, everybody I know who knows her says that this Hillary Clinton, this Methodist who actually came to social justice through her Methodist faith, really and truly exists. And because of religious division right now, and I think in particular because so many more secular and liberal voters identify religion with hatred of gay people. In particular, I think the gay rights issue has really created a kind of polarization where more secular liberals look at religious people generally with a suspicion that they didn't have 20 years ago. There were still these splits, but you have a lot more secular people and a lot more suspicion. And so I think the Clinton campaign was tongue-tied and caught in a, they just couldn't move on this issue because they didn't want to alienate the base young voters who were more secular. But in the process, they lost a chance to talk to a lot of voters who were religious, and I think might have made, when margins are this small, everything can be made a difference. Maybe she should just gone out and talked to Ukrainians. But, that I think a more explicit appeal around her religion, just talking about it, might have made enough difference to flip those 3 states.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think she talked to religious voters. They were just African-American women.
Yes.
That's who she talked to.
Yes.
She didn't go talk to anybody else about it, right?
And, it's funny you say that because her best moment talking about religion was her victory speech after the South Carolina primary. Yeah. And I asked a friend, I said, why doesn't she do that more? Somebody who knew her well. Mm-hmm. And he told me, he talked about the divisions in the campaign, but he also said that speech came from spending a lot of time in African-American churches. And it was the rhetoric of African-American Christianity. But as both Barack Obama and Martin Luther King showed, that rhetoric has appeal across racial lines.
Yes, and that's a different kind of issue. But yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
You agree with that?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it.
It doesn't appeal to racists, but it appeals to a lot of other white people.
But it's sort of like that part where we talked about Barack Obama not using that moral thing when he was in office. It was that, but it's always the relentless campaign to say he wasn't a Christian, right? So even if he used moral language, that moral language was diffused by the populist roar of "he's a Muslim," right? This is what the thing I'm thinking about, how populism gets weaponized in these certain kinds of ways to do things. And so the other question I had for you, I was just saying, is there just even, and I'm the religious studies professor, I think I have an answer in my head, but I'd like to hear you address it, are just some Christian beliefs or some beliefs just lend themselves more to populism? Do they lend themselves to a certain kind of populism that is not about bringing people together, but about splitting them apart? And even this eschatological question that you talk about with Harvey Cox. I mean, not everybody is always sitting there thinking that a bomb is going to drop on them, but evangelicals are all the time.
2 things on it. First, on Obama, if you haven't read it, I think Obama's 2006 call to renewal speech to Jim Wallace's group is the best effort by a politician in recent years to define the parameters of our religious discussion, because Barack Obama spoke of the obligations of non-believers to accept that believers will bring their faith to the public square, and he pointed out that many movements for social justice, including civil rights and abolition, came out of religious faith. But he also said that there were obligations of believers to non-believers because we were not a nation with a state religion, and we believed in religious liberty. It was a really well-done speech, and he hit liberals, and he hit conservatives in a way that tried to create a genuine common ground for everybody to stand on. So that's A on Obama. B, I think that the question on which parts of Christianity can be mobilized, you probably had the same experience I have, is you can almost always tell what kind of, we'll just leave it to Christians for now, what kind of Christian somebody is by the passages they pick. That's why I picked John 3:16 on the one side or Leviticus on the other, versus people who quote the Sermon on the Mount or Isaiah, Micah, and Amos and Exodus. But again, I think that progressives, the share of people outside the African American community who are religious in the progressive community has shrunk very substantially. And there are still great activists. A lot of Catholics got arrested, a bunch of Catholics got arrested yesterday, demonstrating for the Dreamers. And I love my friend, Father Tom Reese, who tweeted, "Thank you for the politeness of the police who arrested him." And I couldn't resist saying, now here's a true Christian, thanking the cops who arrested him. So there still are liberal Christians, but I think the balance has changed and made it much more complicated to engage in this kind of politics. Before we go, I want to take up, I'm going to stop now, but you threw a challenge out at me, and I want to try to find a short way of answering your plea for the kind of politics I'm thinking about, but I'll go to the audience first.
Sure. So questions from the public here. Jean?
Yeah, I mean, being a political theorist, first of all, I agree with 99.9% of what actually voting says, because I don't think that's you'll see from my talk, I don't see my talk tomorrow.
Is there,
The mic's
oh,
coming.
hang on, Waleed has a mic.
Okay, I said I believe with this is not interesting. I agree with 99% of what EJ and Anthea said, but I'm a political theorist, so I can't help coming back to this issue of populism because for very, very serious reasons. So what about this? Can you name a single populist government regime that is not anti-democratic in the sense that they don't go after the courts, they don't go after the free media, they don't go after the basic democratic norms of mutual tolerance and of not, using the nuclear option in constitutional politics, etc. I think whether you consider it populism of the left or populism of the right, these terms, I don't like these terms because both of them can be anti-democratic and anti-Republican, anti-liberal. In the political sense, I'm not talking about neoliberalism. So what I would suggest is maybe, again, this is just a possibility of a way to think about it. And that would be, in the movement phase, because populism is also an artifact of a democratic structure, you appeal to the people, democracy, populist sovereignty. In the movement phase, it's quite possible, as the early movement of the American Populist Party, People's Party, it was made alliances, it wasn't, it wasn't exclusionary and all of that. But once they joined the Democratic Party, once you move from the movement to the party phase, once you're attempting to get power, already a different logic came in. Let's not forget that's the moment the anti-Semitism came in, but also the racism. And so movement, party, government, regime, there's a logic there. So I would suggest that the American Populist Party, as a la John Judas, in a sense, you could say it had ultimately progressive effects that the progressives took over, but that's because they lost, possibly. Again, I don't want to get into a historical debate about the party. I'm not an historian. I'm not that interested in that debate. I like Stille, I like all these analysts, but that's not my issue. My issue is, this is 2000. What year is this? 2018, and as I said, I'm not seduced by the left-right populist distinction for the late 20th and 21st century, and I think we got to look at the logic of this stuff more closely, but maybe this is just my own obsession. Okay, that's all.
A quick question, a quick answer. I think it's fair to say that parties that can legitimately be called populist govern successfully in a lot of states in the United States. A nonpartisan league in North Dakota, the Farmer Labor Party in Minnesota, the Progressive Party in Wisconsin was in many ways a populist party. I think you can look to places like Kansas, Oklahoma, and Colorado that had decent populist governments that actually did practical things. I mean, there's still, I think North Dakota still has a government-owned bank of all things. I don't know if they've gotten rid of it yet. The Republican legislature may have tried to get rid of it, but they had a government-owned bank forever because of the populist movement and the fights with the railroads. So those are examples in the United States. If you look at the nature of the FDR coalition, it brought together a lot of populist elements into this larger coalition. A lot of the people who had voted populist, a lot of the places that had voted populist voted for FDR. I think John Dewey once said that TR took the revivalist themes of Bryan and made them sound high church, and that's why he won and Bryan lost. And then I think a lot of the left in Europe, Syriza is a populist party in Greece, for better or worse. And I think the other problem is a lot of parties begin with fairly strong populist appeals, and it's hard to be populist when you've held power for quite a while. So I think there are left of center parties that began as relatively populist and moderated in power. There are probably some examples of that on the right. So I think that's the difficulty. But I think the more I have read, my talk reflected the fact that I've been thinking a lot about this as you have. And the more I read, the more trouble I have with how do you actually define populism, because I think it is such a vexed concept. And I know the kind I like and I know the kind I don't, but I think there are legitimate fights over the definition of populism, too. That's why Mueller teaches us something, but so does Judas and so does Postel. Go ahead.
I'll leave it at that. I'll leave it.
Question here.
Thank you so much for such a fantastic discussion and such a timely moment. So this morning in The Atlantic, Ta-Nehisi Coates announced that he will be the writer of Captain America, dropping July 4th, right, which is controversial in a number of ways, but it seems like a kind of outgrowth of the Obama strategy of taking the emblematic position of the population, right, president, and then pushing from the inside to have another set of associations inside of belonging, right? So in this case, like the kind of post-war propaganda figure, but written in a totally different voice, obviously, right? And wrangling with what it means to inhabit the body of Captain America. And I think in a way you can see the birther conflict as the right's recognition simultaneously that the population is not what populism is up to, because they no longer want to recognize a number of the kinds of people that comprise the American population, right? And the trick of the birther movement is to never name blackness, but to call it Islamophobia, right? Everything else but, so that you can kind of put everything together as the ultimate other, right? So I've been wondering, right, if it might be time to think about, like, I don't know if this sounds totally banal or radical, but like amending the Constitution so that immigrants can be president, and just taking the conflict head on and associating that the emblems, right, from the inside at the highest positions at least have a chance of reflecting what the population is actually comprised of, so that whatever the question of the people that I think Jean keeps coming back to, right, can in fact reflect the demographics that in fact are who we are.
Please.
Well, the first thing you said when you said, can immigrants become president, I just had a flash in my mind of Arnold Schwarzenegger running, right? But therein lies the problem. I mean, I think let me start there before I get back to Ta-Nehisi. The problem is that the nostalgia piece of all this is that everybody wants to wipe away their immigrant past. And so that if we can get rid of being an immigrant, we can make ourselves fully American and ignore the 400 years of history this nation has had. And so I don't know that that'll work, because you have people who don't know how to govern right now to even change a constitution, let alone actually know what it says. So I think actually this is one of the effects of populism in this country, is that nobody knows what it's like to be a citizen anymore. because everybody has to figure out what group they're going to be in, how they're going to manage themselves in that group. How do I please the people in that group? But they see themselves as being the authentic representation of what this country is. And so now let's back up to Ta-Nehisi. So Ta-Nehisi doing Captain America, my first question was, I laughed and I thought, well, this is going to be interesting because Captain America will now have lots of questions about America, right? Because, if that's voiced through an African-American man, I know if I was doing Captain America, I'd be like, like tomorrow I'm leaving, I'm abdicating or something. Right? Because I don't know if I can deal with what is happening. But I actually think it's good because basically everyone else has had to put themselves into this white ideal of what America is, right? And so to turn that idea around and to put it on its head is something radical and populist all at the same time, because it allows somebody else to voice this. And the problem I see, one of the issues right now with this populist vision is that there are a cacophony of voices about what is America. And so Captain America as a representation of this populist vision of, we have a hero that will fight for the country, who has a shield, who has the red, white, and blue on, and everything else. This is just taking away something from a group of people who probably feel like they own Captain America. And now we have to give it to the people who don't really deserve to talk about Captain America. So all I see is it's going to make people really, a group of people very upset. And that I don't know, it may be worth it to upturn it on its head. I'm not sure. But I do think that these symbols have a lot to do with what populism is all about. And that if you don't have a religious background, then it's the symbols of what America are and what you think it is that make you have a religious vision about it, even if you don't have any religion at all.
I don't have any strong views on the Captain America issue, I confess, and I suspect it's a very shrewd move on their part because there are many more people talking about Captain America right now because Ta-Nehisi is doing that than there would have been without him. Just one quick thing on Obama and religion, though. I once wrote that Obama's religious hero had to be Job, because when he was a Christian, it was said that he was actually a Muslim. And then when it was finally conceded that he was a Christian, his pastor was Jeremiah Wright, so he was a defective kind of Christian. And it was a very peculiar struggle, and I actually think it had the unfortunate effect of stilling his voice a little bit on these questions. In other words, he didn't stop talking about it entirely. Still gave the prayer breakfast speeches. I'm not wild about the prayer breakfast, but that's another issue. But I don't think he was as present as he was early on because he got this debate, and I think the Democratic Party, which after 2004 was traumatized by their loss of religious people, did an enormous amount of thinking and organizing, won in 2008, and kind of gave up on the religion. Well, there are a few exceptions, God bless them all, they're doing the work, but I think the donors and the like pulled back from the religious project, and that Obama did some too because it always blew up in his face.
And everybody forgets one big thing. You think about Jeremiah Wright as the big problem, right? But you have to go back to when he originally said he was going to run and gave his speech in front of the Illinois State House, that he told Jeremiah Wright he could not pray that day. And so that was the moment that it was already beginning that he had to erase all of this. I gotta reset this narrative.
Right. He knew that.
And he knew it, and he did it. But it doesn't matter how much he said Jesus, nothing. He could have carried a Bible every day. It was never going to convince anybody.
Although again, he got 50. I don't know if Tom is still there. I think Obama, the first time around, 57% of his votes came from white people. Yeah. In other words, that he lost the white vote, but that he got a very large white vote. Now, it was much more in the Northeast and the Midwest and the West Coast than in the South. There was a difference. It varied sharply state by state. Nonetheless, he did get a very substantial white vote. And I think that unifying message combined with a heap of economic trouble, I mean, he ran in the best possible year for a Democrat to be running, got through to a lot of people. And that I worry that we go one way or the other on this. Some people try to say Obama won, therefore we don't have any racial problems in the country. No, we don't need a Voting Rights Act. Yes, we do. On the other hand, That was a very significant statement on on the part of a significant number of Americans. And just because Donald Trump won in the Electoral College, we shouldn't lose the hope that that victory gave us at the time, because it is possible. There is a progressive coalition possible. And I was thinking of what you asked me, and the thing I've been thinking about a lot lately is that the first word of our Constitution is, may I ask you what it is? We. I love having people say we. The first word of our Constitution is we, and we have to somehow reclaim both the right and the duty to say we. And that I think that there are two pieces of an argument that need to be made. One is we want to get out of this era of radical division where everybody can't stand each other, and where everybody is dumping on each other and pretending that we're not all American, and that we got to be we again. And then we have to answer the discontents that people have, because a very large chunk of the country, African American, Latino, white, Asian, did not participate in the economic growth of the last 30 years. And that the commitment of the next government has to be not to miraculously transform this, but actually to begin the reversal of this vast inequality and start pulling some people up, particularly the next generation coming in. And to me, around those two broad themes is an argument that progressives can begin to make.
Thanks. That was a fantastic talk. It was beautifully given as well. So just to go back to Jean's point, Jean, we'll take this from a more kind of constitutional point of view, but it strikes me one of the problems in sorting out this question of populism is that we often don't distinguish between liberalism on the one hand, or political liberalism, and democracy. And there are illiberal democracies, right? And so populism takes up what you could call, what Honig calls the democratic paradox, which is to say, the people are always at once a demos and a multitude. And the work of one of the things that populism can do is constitute a means of reconstituting the people from the multitude on a quotidian basis. Because often what we do is we imagine that this constituting power that the people are, right, the Declaration of Independence, is a moment that passes, and then, give over the running of politics to essentially what has become a technocratic managerial state. And the people then, the question of popular sovereignty is only a constituting moment, but constitutive power is the power of the people, and it has to be renewed constantly in a quotidian fashion. So populism is an answer to that. It's a way of thinking about the democratic paradox, and it doesn't necessarily parse along liberal values. That is an open question, but the two things are separate conceptually. And the part of the problem with liberalism, with its focus on, beginning with Locke and property, is that it makes it very difficult to imagine, once you've constituted, especially a kind of democratic capitalism, how that more progressive form of populism might be able to find its place at the level of governance. Because essentially what I see happening, and I think the most important question, is that there is popular sentiment that is harnessed and put to work for those who are in positions of power. Because we know for a fact that the great, this white group of evangelicals, or the white working class in the Rust Belt, voted for Trump in voting against their own interests, right? And so essentially this is a way in which, and this is a Marxist critique of liberal rights as well, of bourgeois rights, they are a ruse of power. And that Trump is harnessed for the sake of, essentially the guy, could there be a better statement of American capitalism than having a brand? The man isn't just, kind of sort of symbol of American oligarchy. He is in his own person a brand. And from my perspective, what's happening with the evangelicals in this post-denominational moment, which is something that most people empirically don't pay much attention to, is that you have a series of extremely mobile religious entrepreneurs, and Anthea has done a lot of work on this, and you can look at the Palin case as a good example of this, these networked forms of Christianity, whose job it is to become kind of entrepreneurs, to create public rhetoric, and to serve, by and large, the interests of this variety of business, corporate, elites. And so you get these bizarre bedfellows with libertarians on the one hand and, financiers, the Koch brothers, and conservative evangelicals who are, increasingly bizarre in their theology.
Yeah.
And so the point is can we call that populism any longer? If it's simply the harnessing of popular anger in the service of vested interests.
Go ahead, you go first.
Two things on that. Thank you very much for that. The first is on technocrats. Every regime that takes power in a genuinely democratic system ends up needing technocrats. I shared a cab with someone who does work on nuclear proliferation. I actually want somebody with a lot of knowledge. I think everybody down the street, and no matter where you go, I want somebody with a whole lot of technological knowledge to deal with nuclear questions. I think that every sort of popular left regime that's ever taken power has had to struggle with the question of we need expertise to run a whole lot of the institutions that we are now in charge of running. And the question is, how do you create democratic accountability for those people who have technical knowledge that we collectively desperately need? And that's where I think one of the things we have to think about is the decay of various intermediate democratic institutions. The labor movement is the most obvious one. I think people who are as secular as could be might actually worry about the decline of the churches because they could be a useful democratic mediating group. The decline of election turnout, particularly in local elections, which Donald Trump may actually be taking care of. This may be one of his great contributions to our public life. But I think that's a problem that parties of the Democratic left struggle with all the time, and they never come up with quite a satisfactory solution. But you need enough democratic life underneath it all to make it work. The second thing, it relates to that, which is the reason liberal democracy has survived reasonably well for 100 years is because liberalism was corrected by social democrats, by democratic socialists, by Christian Democrats in many cases, where we have not had a pure liberal regime. We have had welfare state capitalism. We have had some public ownership capitalism. We've had a mixed economy. And that, again, there's a great moment. Some of you may remember an old Lena Wertmuller movie called Swept Away, where her husband has an affair with a communist, and her denunciation of she's sick of her husband, and she looks at him and says, "You are nothing but a social democrat." And I always say, I am nothing but a social democrat. I identified with the poor husband because I think that social democracy and the combinations of social and Christian democracy were efforts to preserve the freedoms that liberalism allowed, but actually tried to make those freedoms real for all of the people left out, and accepted that capitalism unconstrained can tend toward crisis. And I still think we're struggling, both Christian and social democratic parties are in a heap of trouble right now, and that we're struggling through a period where we need to figure out how, in a different period, to make that sort of politics work again.
I just want to take one little piece of your question. It's interesting you brought up networks, because I think one of the things that happened, especially with Trump, is that he figured out a way to market this in a very different way, and that everybody forgot that we think about evangelicals as a monolith, but this is a fracturing that has happened, and it was already starting to happen in 2008. I mean, if you go back to 2008 and you think about Palin was not, what some people say she was. She's not an evangelical. She's a Pentecostal. 2012, you get, the Republicans let in Mitt Romney, a Mormon. So by the time you get to 2016, the old things don't mean what they mean anymore. And so what you're looking at is a way to, how do we put together a religious coalition that doesn't look like what it looked like before, which is why you get Jerry Falwell Jr. and all these other people, and the Dobsons of the world who used to run it are not the front and center people anymore. They are in the background. I mean, it's Paula White, which brings up my other favorite topic. It's prosperity gospel. And so we haven't even started talk about this yet. And that's, something that I'm really interested in, because the issue is that the way that Trump appeals in his populism is that you can be rich too. You can get it from God if you just do whatever I say, and I'm going to make that possible for you. What did he do today? Let's put these high tariffs on the steel. You're going to get back your jobs. Look at what I just did. So everything is sort of like this dog and pony show to make people think that they're going to get something back, and they feel this populist air in the air because they think maybe we're finally going to come back. It was the same thing with the coal, right? You make promises like a preacher that you can't keep. Right? But it's all in the service of a certain kind of populism that allows you to believe that you are part of something. And then, the other piece about this is that we haven't gotten there yet, and I know there's a panel on media, and I wish I could just go jump on that one too. But this whole idea about how the media makes you think that there's a certain kind of populism in the air. And that really happened starting with the Tea Party and everything else, is that they showed the rallies constantly. And you thought that Trump was a populist too because the rallies were on constantly, right? And it looked like it was a great thing, and you feel a part of a movement. And it's the same thing with Bernie, right? Until somebody confronted Bernie, which I'm going to talk about tomorrow. But it's the interesting way in which people there's a sentiment and an affect about what populism is that make people feel that there's a part of something new and different and big that draws into this, even if it might not be populist at its core.
Not bring the go ahead. Go ahead. Go ahead, Kathy.
Okay, thanks. I want to just kind of reiterate Ruth's question, where she asked, is the harnessing of popular anger in service of powerful interests really populism? And think of something we're probably going to talk about more tomorrow, but the issue of how this anger is being harnessed, and come back a little more explicitly to technologies and media, and then the whole uproar we're experiencing with the role of, say, Russian interests, or these kind of chat rooms that are really shaping public discourse, and especially this public anger in ways that we're coming to realize more and more clearly, even in recent weeks.
I want to go back to a different book Mark Lilla wrote, because I always feel bad disagreeing with him because I really respect him so much. He wrote a book called The Reactionary Mind that was a collection of really powerful essays on the rise of the right before we saw all of this rising of the right. And I think we're at a peculiar moment, and this is not unlike the 30s, where reactionary, backward-looking movements arise because people feel a great sense of dislocation from economics, from immigration patterns, and we do have more global movement of people and refugees, and I want to distinguish between refugees and immigrants, but also immigration than we had before. So there are a lot of people feeling uprooted, and one response to that is to turn to reactionary movements, and yet these reactionary movements are able to weaponize extraordinary technologies, and certainly, that's what happened in Europe in the 1930s. We're lucky we had Roosevelt weaponizing the same technology on behalf of broadly democratic ideas. I think technology is neutral. Technology spreads truth real fast, and it spreads lies real fast. But I do think technology, and this is a commonplace thought, technology does seem to be pushing us into smaller and smaller groups, because it's in the interest of the people who run, Google or Facebook or whatever you're using to make you happy. And you'll be happier if you see views you agree with, people you agree with. And that technology also has made it easier for extremists to look like they're a big, big group of people. That these, when you think of sort of extreme right books that spread through the American system, none dare call it treason. It had to be done through these little publishers. Now there's a network, television network that does it, and this stuff can spread in all kinds of ways. Now, some of that's positive. It means that people can challenge whatever the mainstream or the establishment is in ways they couldn't. But I think it also enables pretty extreme ideology to enter the mainstream rather quickly.
I don't know if I'd say it was neutral, but that's a conversation we can have another time. Let me just say one thing that it just happened not this long ago. They figured out how to take out the bots from Twitter, right? When they did all the Russian bots. So the morning I got up, I looked at Twitter. There were conservatives who I sort of follow that they don't know I'm following them. That, because I don't need to let them know that I'm following them. That were like, I lost, 10,000 followers last night. This is horrible. But those were all bots, right? And so they were having conversations with this, which gets to the thing from dislocation. This located them in a certain place, right? Because they had these fake accounts following them that had like flags and MAGA and, God bless America and all this stuff. And then those accounts disappeared in an instant. And they really thought they were having conversations with people. Same thing happened with Black Lives Matter. There were people, they'd taken faces, how do you look like this or whatever, and, let's fight the man and do all this other stuff. And those, not real accounts. Not real accounts. And so what I find interesting about this is that this technology may start off benign, but it's being weaponized. And Facebook knows it, Twitter knows it, it's moved to Instagram, and now we have a bigger problem because these are platforms that are used in populist movements. And so these platforms aren't as benign as we would like to think they are just because they're technological. Reddit is a big one. At 4chan, when they moved out of Reddit to start doing all this other stuff that they did, that was just, fantastical about the horrible things that happened to people. But that's also kind of a populist movement in a way that has its own internal core about what they think their moral actions are supposed to be.
Just my favorite story on this theme, that it was either in Houston or Dallas where the Russians started an anti-Muslim group and called a demonstration, and they started a group for Muslims, and they called a counter-demonstration. And anybody who showed up on either side was actually called there by the Russians and not a single other American. That's really that's quite a trick. Fortunately, I don't think they were huge, but it was getting pretty heated.
Well, the other thing on the thing of the technologies that I think is worth, one of the paradoxes, and we'll talk about it some tomorrow at the media panel, that the new technology poses is that by its definition, it's populist in the sense that, for example, what trends in whether it's Twitter or Facebook is literally the thing that is shared the most, that is followed the most. And yet what we've discovered to our chagrin in the last year and a half is that system is very easy to game. And so by the use of fake bots, by one of the panelists tomorrow did a great study where he was looking at the most popular Twitter accounts, and there was this one character, like, who is this person who has however many hundreds of thousands of followers, who's being had this enormous influence, and it turns out to be some guy in his 70s in his basement in a house in Nevada, and somebody weaponized his Twitter account, and he's like tweeting 500 times a day, and then ended up building this thing. So it looks like a popular movement. It's one guy in his basement. And so sorting out this, the impact of this between the filter bubbles that are created by the technology with certain genuine popular elements to it, together with the manipulative potential, it's very hard to untangle.
I just was sitting here thinking, I still love living in a country where one guy in a basement can have this all effect. But anyway, go ahead.
I think we have time for one more question, and then there's a reception down the hall.
I know that the focus of the conference is on the American case, but in the same way as Jean has argued, you cannot discuss the American case without trying to develop a general theory of populism. Your reference to the general crisis of social democracy and Christian democracy makes also evident that the contemporary moment is a global general crisis of democracy. And without addressing it, all our solutions are going to be not solutions. I mean, I think there is no single democracy. Maybe Canada is the only happy democracy today, and Liechtenstein. Otherwise, every democratic country in the world is in crisis today and in serious threat of populist rhetorics of all kinds. And obviously, all forms of dictatorship are on the global scene, gaining, again, strength over democracy. So I think that I myself, my presentation, I simply analyze the contemporary nativist moment as a continuation of a long history of nativism. But there is something about the present global context of the crisis that if we don't address it, we cannot find a response to it.
I mean, I feel like saying amen. Portugal and Australia, I think, are pretty happy at the moment. They're sort of holding on there. One of the fascinating questions to me is how do we figure out which problems of democracy are shared across all these lines and which aren't? For example, how much is immigration itself, independent of any economic developments, a raw fact that has created right-wing populist movements? If you look at a place like the Netherlands, which has a quite successful economy, a reasonably fair economy in terms of the distributions, a rather strong welfare state. Now, what you have is the rise of something new, which is welfare state bigotry, where people want to defend the welfare state but don't want to share it with newcomers because, and they have a moral argument they can make, which is we built this is ours, and we did it so we would protect each other, and you shouldn't be able to get use of it so easily. There is a way you can, without condemning them as bigots, but nonetheless, immigration is something that is sort of happening and being weaponized, and a lot of people on the left like me tend to talk about this more in terms of economics and economic discontent. But I think we have to disentangle immigration versus economics. And then I also think we have to disentangle sort of values in a that's a vague, dangerous term that I just threw on the table. But I think there is a great alienation on the part of older people in a lot of countries with the radical change in values that they see around them, given the values that younger people embrace. And I think that is also part of this reaction. I don't want to go backward myself on any of the basic questions that are in dispute, but it's something else we have to understand. So, and I do think the problems of Brexit, while you can say that, well, Brexit has a lot in common with the rise of Le Pen, has a lot in common with the rise of the AfD in Germany, I also think that we got to figure out the particularities. Something universal, almost universal, seems to be happening, and yet there are a lot of particular causes. Yeah, globalism is global and local, exactly.
I would add one thing on the sort of crisis of social democracy in general, which is economic in nature. The economist Benjamin Friedman wrote a book several years ago called The Moral Consequences of Growth, where he pointed out that in low-growth economies you have a proliferation of reactionary, xenophobic, intolerant movements. Right. And the fact that we've seen we're in this moment of kind of late capitalism where economies that were growing at 3 or 4% per year suddenly began growing at 1% a year or less. There's widespread economic stagnation in much of Western Europe, in France, in Italy. I was looking at the numbers because I write in Italy. They really went backwards over the last 20 years, so it's not surprising that the Social Democratic Party is going to pay a big price, and the populist movements are growing. It's easy to be inclusive when the wind is at your back and your sails are full because there's more to share, and that's also part of, I think, what happened here. So as a result, policies that involve better sharing of wealth, better distribution of wealth may be the answer, because the growth may not be there, and it becomes very difficult to make these kind of arguments in a low-growth world.
And Tom Edsel wrote a book about that called The Age of Scarcity about 4 years ago, Tom? Yep. I like to plug my friends' books. I hope you'll forgive me.
So are we we're going to break now and continue on a more casual basis across the hall
Yes,
in the
there's-
World Room.
There's a reception down the hall in the World Room, and thank you to our speakers.
And
Thank you so much.
EJ. Thank you. Great job.
How come we've never been on a panel?
I don't know. It's,
No, we have to fix
God,
this. I
it's
could
not
go on the-
fair.
I could go on the road with you.
that would be fun. I'd like
It
that.
would be a lot of fun. Thank you so much. That was really cool.